Inside a cozy, inviting mansion tucked in a lovely estate, a storm was raging. Not of wind or rain, but of prayers. Enkay paced the living room, his hands shaking as he whispered words of supplication. His heart pounded with both fear and hope. His wife Sarah was upstairs, screaming in agony, her frail body battling to bring forth the child they had prayed for, fasted for, waited 32 years for. "Please, God, don't take him away before we even see his face," Enkay murmured, his eyes glistening with tears. The midwife and the doctor hurried in and out of the bedroom, their expressions tense. The labor had stretched on for hours. Too many hours. And Sarah was growing weaker. Then suddenly, silence. A moment so deep it felt as though the world had stopped breathing. Enkay froze. His chest tightened. Was this it? Had they lost both mother and child? Then a cry. A sharp, piercing wail filled the mansion, cutting through the tension, filling the air with raw life. Enkay let out a sob, his knees buckling as relief flooded him. The midwife rushed down the stairs, a bright smile on her exhausted face. "It's a boy." Enkay stumbled forward, gripping her shoulders. "Sarah. Is she?" "She's weak," the midwife admitted, "but she's alive. And so is your son." "He's a miracle, Mr. Enkay." "A miracle?" That was exactly what he was. That very evening, the estate came alive in celebration. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers poured into the mansion to celebrate the arrival of the child who had been long prophesied as the blessing of the Enkay household. There was music, dancing, jollof rice, and laughter that echoed through the night. People whispered excitedly about the boy's future. "This child is destined for greatness. He will be the pride of this estate." Tim grew up under the warmth of his parents' unwavering love. He was not like the other children in the estate. No, Tim was different. Where others played football in the streets, Tim sat in a corner with a book. Where other boys got into fights, Tim stepped in to break them apart. He was brilliant, polite, always ready to help. He never spoke back to elders, never caused trouble, and never sought attention. The parents in the estate began using him as an example. "Why can't you be like Tim?" they would scold their own children. But Tim never let it get to his head. He remained humble, kind, and eager to learn. His parents, though they were not wealthy, made sure he never lacked love and guidance. The only thing they couldn't give him was a top-tier education. "We'll enroll him in a good government school," Sarah insisted. "With his intelligence, he will rise above his circumstances." And so, Tim was enrolled in Queensville Government School, a place where the classrooms were overcrowded, the textbooks were outdated, and the teachers were overworked. Despite the challenges, Tim's brilliance shone through. His answers in class were always sharp. His handwriting was the neatest, and his thirst for knowledge was unmatched. That was when Mr. Johnson took notice. A strict but kind-hearted teacher, Mr. Johnson had seen many bright students over the years. But Tim was special. "This boy has the kind of mind that only comes once in a generation," Mr. Johnson told the other teachers. So he took Tim under his wing. Every day after school, he tutored Tim privately, exposing him to books far beyond his grade level. He taught him not just what was in the syllabus but how to think. Tim soaked it all in, hungry for more. Then came the biggest opportunity of his life. Mr. Johnson registered Tim for a prestigious scholarship program, one that offered a full ride to Bellary School, one of the best secondary schools in Lagos. "Do you think I can really win?" Tim asked hesitantly, clutching the application forms. "Tim," Mr. Johnson smiled, "you won the moment you were born." The scholarship exams were tough, the competition fierce. The other children who applied were from elite private schools, with fancy tutors and expensive textbooks. Tim had only his mind. But when the results came out, there was his name right at the top. Tim had done it. His parents cried tears of joy. Mr. Johnson beamed with pride. The estate buzzed with excitement. Tim was leaving behind the government school, leaving behind the only life he had ever known. He was stepping into a world of the rich, the privileged, the elite. His parents packed his bags, reminding him to stay humble, to remain the good boy he had always been. "I will," Tim promised, hugging them tightly. The moment Tim arrived at Bellary School, he felt it. It was in the polished floors, the towering walls, the expensive cars parked outside. It was in the way the other students walked with confidence, their branded clothes crisp, their sneakers spotless. Tim stepped into the grand halls of Bellary School, his heart pounding in his chest. The ceiling stretched high above, chandeliers glittered like tiny suns, and the air smelled of polished wood and something Tim couldn't quite place: money. Everything about the school screamed wealth. The students walked with effortless confidence, their clothes sharp, their bags designer. The walls were lined with gold plaques listing the names of past students who had gone on to become CEOs, politicians, and world leaders. Tim swallowed hard. He was no stranger to feeling different, but here the difference felt like a chasm too wide to cross. Then the whispers began. "Who's that? The scholarship boy. Seriously. Look at his uniform. He looks like he got it from a thrift shop. What's he even doing here?" Tim clenched his fists, forcing himself to ignore them. He belonged here. He had earned his place. The first week was brutal. Tim's dorm room was massive, shared with 3 other boys who barely acknowledged his existence. Their beds were covered with expensive duvets, their desks filled with gadgets Tim had only seen in magazines. The cafeteria was worse. Long tables filled with students talking loudly, laughing in groups, moving in packs. Tim had always been quiet, always been more comfortable alone. But here, being alone wasn't just normal, it was a target. The first few days, he sat at the edge of the cafeteria, eating quickly, hoping no one would notice him. But the noticing had already begun. Then came the first encounter. Tim was walking to class, his books pressed to his chest, when he felt a shove from behind. He stumbled forward, nearly falling. Laughter erupted around him. A tall boy with piercing blue eyes and a smirk on his face leaned against the lockers. Sure. Tim had heard his name before. Everyone knew him. The king of Bellary. "Hey, scholarship kid," Asher drawled. "You dropped something." Tim turned, confused. Asher held out a crumpled 500 Nigerian Nairas note. Tim blinked. "That's not mine." "Oh." Asher grinned, his friends laughing behind him. "I just assumed you needed it." Tim's cheeks burned. He wanted to disappear. "I don't need your money," he muttered, trying to walk past. But Asher stepped in front of him. "You got a big mouth for someone who doesn't belong here," he whispered, his smile never fading. "I'd watch that if I were you." Tim said nothing. He knew better than to pick a fight he couldn't win. But the damage was done. The hierarchy had been established. And Tim. He was at the very bottom. Tim threw himself into his studies. Every night, while his classmates partied or played games, he sat at his desk, studying harder than ever. His only friend was his notebook. His only comfort the words of Mr. Johnson echoing in his head. "You won the moment you were born." But as the weeks passed, something shifted. His focus began to slip. His confidence wavered. The whispers turned to laughter. The laughter turned to pranks. One day, he opened his locker to find rotten food inside. Another day, someone poured ink on his notebook, ruining his notes. But the final blow came in class during a math lesson. Mr. Davidson, the strictest teacher in Bellary, called on Tim to solve a difficult equation on the board. Tim stood up, took the chalk and froze. His brain, usually sharp and fast, went blank. The room was silent, waiting, watching. Then a voice from the back. "Guess even geniuses choke sometimes." Laughter rippled through the class. Tim's face burned. He got the answer wrong. For the first time in his life, Tim Akin was failing. Tim felt himself changing. The once confident, intelligent boy now dreaded going to class. He avoided the cafeteria at all costs. He stopped speaking up in discussions. And worst of all, his grades began to drop. Teachers noticed. Principal Smith noticed. One afternoon, the principal called him into his office. "Tim," Mr. Smith said gently, "your grades are slipping. What's going on?" Tim hesitated. Should he tell him? Should he expose everything? But then he remembered Asher's smirk. The whispered threats. "Nothing, sir," he said instead. "I've just been tired." Mr. Smith studied him. "I've seen this before, son. A good boy gets caught in the wrong crowd, and before he knows it, he's lost himself." Tim's stomach twisted. "I'm fine," he lied. The principal sighed. "Tim, I see terrible things happening if you continue down this path." Tim clenched his jaw. A path. He wasn't even part of a crowd. He was just trying to survive. But surviving wasn't enough anymore. That night, he sat in his room, staring at the wall. Was this really how it was going to be? Always alone. Always the target. Then the door creaked open. Familiar voice. "Sure." "Hey, scholarship boy," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Wanna stop being invisible?" Tim hesitated. "Join us," Asher continued. "And maybe people will start seeing you differently." Tim's breath caught. This was it. The opportunity to change everything. To finally fit in. Be seen. So, against every warning in his heart, Tim nodded. Tim knew he was making a mistake. He could feel it deep in his gut, a sharp, nagging warning. But as he stood among the boys that night, watching their easy smiles, hearing their loud laughter, something inside him whispered, "Maybe this is what you need." For the first time since he had arrived at Bellary, people weren't ignoring him. They weren't whispering behind his back or laughing at his clothes. They were looking at him, including him. Asher, the undisputed leader of the group, clapped a hand on Tim's shoulder. "All right, scholarship boy," he grinned. "Let's see if you have what it takes." The boys surrounded Tim, their eyes gleaming with amusement. "Test. Of course there had to be a test." Tim's heart pounded. "What do I have to do?" Asher smirked. "Relax, it's nothing serious." But Tim had seen this before. He had watched other new students fall into this trap. They would be humiliated, pushed to the edge, made to prove their loyalty. And Tim, he was desperate enough to play along. Started small. Walk into the girls' dorm and steal a hairbrush. Tim hesitated. Asher raised an eyebrow. Scared. The boys chuckled. Tim felt his face burn. He knew it was stupid, but he also knew the alternative. If he walked away now, they would never let him live it down. So he did it. He slipped into the girls' dorm, grabbed a random hairbrush from a dresser, and darted back out before anyone noticed. The boys erupted in cheers. "Not bad," Asher said. But that was just warm-up. And that was how it began. First it was little things. Stealing a teacher's marker. Sneaking out past curfew. Lying about who broke a window. Each time the boys laughed and cheered. Each time Tim felt less like himself. His grades continued to drop. Not because he wasn't smart anymore, but because he was too exhausted from trying to keep up with the group. Skipping night studies. Staying up late for pranks. Getting caught in places he wasn't supposed to be. Mr. Smith called him into his office again. "Tim, I don't recognize you anymore," the principal said, shaking his head. "You're throwing away everything you worked for." Tim wanted to listen. He really did. But he also wanted to be accepted. So once again he ignored the warning. And then the tests got worse. It was a Friday night. The students were supposed to be asleep, but Tim found himself standing in the shadows behind the school hall with Asher and the boys. "Dare. Real one. Break into the principal's office and take his watch," Asher whispered, a smirk playing on his lips. Tim felt the blood drain from his face. "That's stealing." "Oh look, he finally grew a conscience." One of the boys scoffed. "It's just a test," Asher said. "Do this, and you're officially one of us. No more jokes. No more scholarship boy talk. You're in." Tim hesitated. He thought about his parents back home, their proud faces. He thought about Mr. Johnson, the teacher who believed in him. He thought about Principal Smith, who had already warned him where this road would lead. He could walk away now. He could still turn back. But then Asher spoke again. His voice quiet and dangerous. If you don't do this, you're done. We'll make sure you regret ever stepping foot in this school. Tim felt his breath catch. He knew what that meant. If he backed out now, they would make his life a living hell. So, against every screaming voice in his head, he did it. He broke into the principal's office, grabbed the expensive gold watch from the desk, and slipped back out into the night. The boys erupted in laughter and cheers. Asher grinned. See, that wasn't so hard, was it? Tim forced a smile. But deep inside he knew. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. The next morning Tim was called to the office. His hands were sweaty as he sat across from Principal Smith. The man looked at him, disappointment heavy in his eyes. I know it was you. Tim's throat went dry. I don't know why you're doing this, Mr. Smith continued. But I see where this is heading, and it doesn't end well. Tim stared at the floor, his chest tight. You're not like them, the principal said. You still have a choice. Tim wanted to believe that. But the truth was, he had already chosen. And he wasn't sure if there was a way back. That night, he met up with Asher and the boys again. They had one last test. Party. A secret, dangerous party on school grounds. And Tim. He didn't hesitate. Because by then, he had stopped being Tim Akin. Tim stood outside an abandoned classroom near the sports field. His heart racing. Inside, muffled music thumped, voices rose in laughter, and bottles clinked together. The secret party had begun. Asher leaned in. His breath tinged with alcohol. Ready for the real fun, scholarship boy? Tim forced a grin. Yeah, he wasn't. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to turn around, to walk away. But he had come too far. He had crossed too many lines. If he backed out now, they would tear him apart. The door swung open, revealing a world Tim had never seen before. Inside, the room was dimly lit with a few flickering candles. The desks had been shoved against the walls, creating space for a crowd of Bellari's most reckless students. There was music, liquor, smoke curling through the air. Tim had never been in a place like this before. His mind screamed danger. But then someone handed him a drink. A plastic cup, filled with something that smelled sharp and unfamiliar. He hesitated. Asher watched him, arms crossed, waiting. Tim lifted the cup to his lips and took a sip. The liquid burned down his throat, making him cough. Laughter erupted around him. Relax, one of the boys said, clapping him on the back. You'll get used to it. Tim wasn't sure he wanted to. But he drank anyway. As the night wore on, the dares began. First, it was small things. Climbing on desks, smashing old classroom windows, stealing the keys to the teacher's lounge. Then, Asher's voice rang out over the noise. All right, final test. The room fell silent. The crew knew what that meant. Tim felt a lump form in his throat. Asher pulled out a small, dark cup and placed it on a desk. Inside was a thick, murky liquid. This, Asher said, is the last step. Tim stared at the cup. His heart pounded against his ribs. What is it, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Asher smirked. Don't worry about it. Just drink. Tim looked around the room. Every eye was on him. The same boys who had mocked him weeks ago were now watching, waiting to see if he was truly one of them. One of the boys nudged him. Come on, man. It's just a drink. Tim's fingers trembled as he reached for the cup. He knew this was wrong. He knew this was dangerous. But he had made his choice a long time ago. So, he lifted the cup to his lips and drank. The room exploded with cheers. Hands slapped his back. Asher grinned. That's it, scholarship boy. You're one of us now. Tim didn't feel like one of them. Minutes passed. Then something shifted. A cold shiver ran down Tim's spine. The room blurred at the edges. His stomach tightened. His skin burned. The voices around him became distant, hollow. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out beneath him. "Hey," he mumbled, gripping the desk for balance. "I don't feel good." Asher's face swam before him. "Relax, it'll pass." But it wasn't passing. Tim's chest tightened. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. The walls felt like they were closing in. Tim stumbled toward the door, desperate for fresh air. Someone grabbed his arm. "Where are you going?" I need to." His vision swam, black spots dancing before his eyes. He pushed past them, staggering into the hallway. Everything felt wrong. The school corridor stretched out before him, twisting, warping. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Then footsteps, loud, dark, angry. Principal Smith. What is going on here? The door behind Tim slammed open, and the boys spilled into the hallway. The party was over. Mr. Smith's eyes darted between the students, his face tight with fury. "Who organized this?" Silence. Tim tried to speak, but the world was spinning too fast. His skin felt like it was on fire. His stomach twisted violently. The principal's sharp gaze landed on him. "Tim." But Tim couldn't answer. His knees buckled. The last thing he heard was someone screaming his name as darkness swallowed him whole. Tim woke up somewhere cold. Bright lights blinded him. Machines beeped softly in the distance. His body felt heavy, weak, wrong. A faint voice drifted into his ears. "Tim, my son." His mother. Tim wanted to speak, to tell her he was sorry, but he couldn't move. A step. Low whispers. The voice of a doctor. "We need to operate immediately." A hand grabbed his. His father. "Hold on, son. Please hold on." Tim felt himself slipping away. Everything faded into a blur. He had wanted to fit in. Now he wasn't sure he'd ever wake up again. The hospital room was eerily quiet. Machines beeped in slow, rhythmic pulses, their steady sounds the only sign that Tim was still alive. Sarah sat beside his bed, her hands gripping his frail fingers. Tears streaked her face. Akin stood near the door, his body stiff, his face unreadable. But inside, he was shattered. His only child, the son he had waited 32 years for, now lay pale and motionless beneath the harsh hospital lights. The doctors had done all they could. Now all they could do was wait. Principal Smith arrived at the hospital later that evening. He stepped into the room, his face carefully neutral. "Mr. and Mrs. Akin," he said, his voice calm, too calm. "I'm deeply sorry about what happened to Tim." Sarah wiped her eyes. "What happened to my son?" Long pause. Too long. Then the lie. "We're not sure," Principal Smith said. "Tim must have fallen sick suddenly. We found him outside the dormitory." Sarah's lips trembled. "That's not possible." "He was fine when I spoke to him last week." Akin's jaw clenched. He didn't trust this man. Something felt wrong. "The school is handling the matter," Principal Smith continued smoothly. "We don't want to cause unnecessary panic. It's best if we keep this situation private." Private. That word sent a chill down Akin's spine. He exchanged a glance with Sarah. Something was being hidden. But before he could press further, the doctor stepped in, his expression grim. "Mr. and Mrs. Akin," he said, his voice low. "We need to talk." Akin and Sarah followed the doctor out of the room, their hands clasped tightly. They were afraid to hear what he had to say. The doctor sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Your son's condition is complicated. He suffered from severe poisoning, but we can't determine the exact substance yet." Sarah's breath caught. "Poisoning?" Kin frowned. "What do you mean? What was in his system?" The doctor hesitated. "We need further tests, but we believe it was some kind of dangerous homemade mixture." A sick feeling churned in Akin's stomach. His eyes flicked to Sarah, who was trembling. "What was my son drinking?" she whispered. Then Principal Smith spoke. He had been standing quietly near the doorway, his hands folded behind his back. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. How come? We don't know, he said. Akin's head snapped toward him. You don't know. Principal Smith shook his head. We found him outside the dormitory in the early morning hours. He must have fallen ill suddenly. Akin knew a lie when he heard one. You're telling me, Akin said slowly, stepping closer, that my son, a brilliant boy, a disciplined student, just happened to collapse in the middle of the night with poison in his system? And no one knows how it happened. Principal Smith didn't flinch. We are investigating. Akin clenched his fists. This was a cover-up. Bellary was an elite school, the pride of Lagos. A scandal like this, a student dying from something illegal on school grounds, would ruin its reputation. Tim's life wasn't their priority. Their reputation was. Akin stormed back into the hospital room, his rage mixing with helplessness. Tim's face was pale, his breath slow, his body fighting a battle he had never been trained for. Sarah was back by his side, stroking his hair gently. Tim, my boy, please wake up. She had already started bargaining with God, promising anything, everything, if only he would return their son to them. Tim's fingers twitched. A shallow breath escaped his lips. Akin's heart leapt. Was he waking up? Sarah sat up, hopeful. Tim, can you hear me? His lips parted slightly. Then, his body convulsed violently. Sarah screamed. Akin grabbed his son's shoulders, shaking him gently. Tim, stay with us, son. Stay with us. The machines beeped wildly. Doctors and nurses rushed in, shouting orders. Sarah was pulled away, wailing. Tim had taken a turn for the worse. His breathing had slowed. His pulse was weak. We have to transfer him, the doctor said. This hospital isn't equipped to handle his condition. Sarah sobbed. Take him anywhere. Just save my son. They rushed him into an ambulance, Sarah riding beside him, whispering prayers, clutching his hand like she could pull him back from the edge. Akin followed behind, his heart pounding as he drove. He wasn't ready to say goodbye. But life doesn't wait until you're ready. By the time they reached the next hospital, the doctors barely had time to check Tim's vitals. His pulse was gone. His breath had stilled. A nurse whispered something to the doctor. Then, in a voice that didn't feel real, the words fell like a hammer on Akin's chest. I'm sorry. He's gone. Sarah let out a scream so raw, so full of anguish, that the hospital walls seemed to absorb her grief. Akin staggered backward, the world spinning. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Tim, his miracle child, was dead. The school covered up the truth. The students who had been at the party said nothing. No one mentioned the drink. No one spoke about the bullying. Even Asher, who had pushed him into the darkness, acted as if nothing had happened. Bellary protected its own. And Tim became just another tragic story. They took Tim's body back home, back to their hometown where he had never even gotten the chance to visit. The entire estate gathered, whispering amongst themselves. This boy had a bright future. He was too good for this world. But none of them knew the truth. None of them knew that Tim had died trying to be something he wasn't. Akin stood by the grave, his hands clenched into fists. He wanted justice. But how do you fight against the rich, the powerful, the untouchable? Sarah collapsed as they lowered the coffin into the ground. Her son was gone, and no one would ever know why. In the end, Tim had only wanted to belong. He had wanted to be seen, to be accepted, to fit in. But he had chosen the wrong crowd. He had traded his brilliance, his future, his very life, for a place at the table of those who never truly cared. And now he was just a name on a gravestone. A lesson whispered in cautionary tales. A warning. Because in the end, fitting in isn't worth losing yourself. And some mistakes can never be undone.